Tom Ellis talk for probably about an hour,
40 minutes.
40 minutes, and then we'll do a discussion, question and answers. So we're really lucky to have Tom Ellis here tonight. He's done this for 8 years in a row?
7.
7 years in a row. On a different topic each year. He always does an outstanding job. And tonight, he's on a topic that's on our minds all the time, war. This is about the war in Laos and the continuing consequences. So we'll go ahead. Tom?
Thanks, Trudy. I don't know if you can hear me. This mic is on, but I'm not sure it works real well. Okay. Well, good evening. My name is Tom Ellis. I'm a member of the Upper Hudson Peace Action and other peace and social justice groups here in the Capital District. Tonight I will talk about the United States war in Laos and its continuing consequences. Before I get started, I wish to thank Trudy Quaife and Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace for inviting me once again to deliver a lecture on a topic of my choice. I got interested in this topic about 15 years ago when I read a full-page article about it in the USA Today. I was stunned and outraged that cluster bomb weapons used by the United States in the 1960s and 70s were and still are continuing to suddenly kill and injure Laotian adults and children, and in large numbers. Equally disturbing is that the United States has done very little to clean up these weapons. Less than 1% have been cleaned up. At current cleanup rates, it will take 1,000 years or more to remove them all. I am horrified at the immorality of the US war in Laos. The US Air Force flew more than 500,000 missions over Laos. The war was kept secret from nearly all of the American people and most of the United States Congress until about 1970. The Congress is our national legislature, and they're supposed to know what the executive branch is doing, but they did not. One reason I chose this topic is to try to understand it better, and I will share with you what I have learned. When I was a kid, I was born in 1955. I often watched the national and international news on TV and learned a lot about the Vietnam War, but not much about the U.S. military activities in Laos that were a part of the war. When President Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia in the spring of 1970, immense demonstrations rocked the United States during the next few weeks and months. But the U.S. had been in Laos for 15 years by then. My plan tonight is to speak about 40 minutes and then facilitate a discussion that you're all welcome to participate in. I know many of you are familiar with this topic, at least a little. So I will discuss the U.S. war in Laos, why the U.S. went to war, cluster bombs, their impact on Laotians, efforts to clean up the cluster bombs, and efforts to ban cluster bombs. Laos is a landlocked nation in Southeast Asia with a long border with Vietnam on the east, Cambodia on the south, Thailand on the west, and short borders with Burma, now known as Myanmar, and China on the north. Laos is almost twice the size of New York State in size. The Mekong River flows along the western border of Laos and through Laos in sections. People have lived in Laos for many thousands of years.
Sounds like bombs out there.
I've never heard one. The earliest residents were hunters and gatherers. Later, farmers grew rice. Laos is famous for its large stone jars, thousands of which are scattered across hundreds of miles. Some weigh up to 7 tons. They are 3 to 10 feet in height and more than 1 meter in diameter. I have some photos of them. The jars are estimated by scientists to be between 2,500 and 3,000 years old. They are made of granite and sandstone. Some jars were moved after being carved. Who made the jars and why is still not agreed upon. The jars may have been carved over several centuries. Some archaeologists believe the jars, some of which once had lids, may have been a combination tomb and tombstone. Later generations may have stored food and other items in the jars. The Khmers, Khmers of Cambodia ruled most of present-day Laos from the 800s to the 1200s. By the 1300s, Laotians ruled their country, and a golden age occurred in the 1600s as part of the Lan Giang Kingdom. Dutch merchants of the East India Company described Laos as having magnificent palaces, temples, and spectacular Buddhist religious ceremonies. The capital, Vientiane Shan, was considered to be among the most beautiful cities in Southeast Asia during the 1600s. The period of decline began around 1700, and in 1893, Laos became a colony of France. France lost control of Laos during World War II, but invaded in 1946 and reestablished colonial rule. The Pathet Lao, which means land of the Lao, was founded in 1950 to regain independence. France withdrew from Laos in 1953 and Vietnam in 1954. Laos was a divided nation from 1953 to 1975, with a royalist government supported by the United States ruling part of the country, and the communist Pathet Lao aligned with the Viet Minh of Vietnam ruling the rest. Civil war sometimes resulted. When Vietnam was reunited in 1975 under communist nationalist rulers, the royalists fled Laos. In December of 1975, 40 years ago this month, the Laos People's Democratic Republic, LPDR, was established. Laos has been ruled by the Pathet Lao, now known as the Lao People's Front, since 1975. In the late 1980s, Laos introduced market capitalism, as did Vietnam and China at about the same time. The United States lifted a 20-year trade embargo in 1995. Laos became a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in 1997. The United States eased trade restrictions in 2005, and a stock market was opened in Vientiane in 2011. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited Laos in July 2012, a year after condemning Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi for using cluster bombs. The U.S. War in Laos. From 1964 to 1973, the U.S. Air Force dropped 2,092,900 tons of bombs on Laos, about the same amount as were dropped in all of World War II. It was one of the heaviest aerial bombardments in world history. The United States flew 580,000 bombing missions, which is equal to one plane load every 8 minutes, 24/7, 365 or 6 for 9 years. Estimates vary widely about how many Laotians were killed by the United States during these years. I've seen numbers as low as 30,000 and up into the hundreds of thousands or even more. So I have no idea how many people were killed in the war by the United States. But at least 270 million cluster bomblets were dropped by the United States on Laos, and at least 80 million of these failed to detonate. The U.S. war in Laos began long before the 1964 start of the bombing. Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri wrote in 1972 that in 1955 the U.S. government began defending the Kingdom of Laos. The U.S. aid to Laos was about $40 million annually in the late 1950s, with most of that going to the Royal Laotian Army. A secretly operated American military mission organized by the U.S. State Department was headquartered in Vientiane. The mission staff were called technicians and led by an American general whose name had been removed from the list of active American Army officers when he took over command of the Laos operation. Symington wrote that when Kennedy became president, the U.S. had about 700 military advisors in Laos, the USSR had about 500, and North Vietnam at least 10,000 soldiers. By 1963, the United States was secretly training Lao pilots and ground crews in Thailand. In June 1964, the United States began bombing northern Laos, far from the Ho Chi Minh Trail of the south. Symington described a series of lies told by the executive branch of the United States government. One of them was when the U.S. bombing of Laos was initially reported in 1964, I think by the French, the U.S. government said U.S. planes were on reconnaissance missions at the request of the Laotian government and were authorized to fire back if fired upon. Symington's article was printed in the Congressional Record in 1972. U.S. attacks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail began in 1965, but were not officially acknowledged until 1970. When the Johnson administration halted bombing of North Vietnam in November 1968, much of the U.S. air war that had been going to Vietnam was redirected to Laos. U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission Montague Stearns testified before Congress in 1969 about this, and he said, this was a quote, "Well, we had all those planes sitting around and couldn't just let them stay there with nothing to do," end quote. One can learn quite a bit about the U.S. war in Laos in American history during the 1950s and 60s by reading and rereading the weekly columns of I.F. Stone, a very famous journalist of the time. In a January 9th, 1961 column, this was a week before Eisenhower delivered his famous farewell address in which he spoke about the military-industrial complex, and 2 weeks before John Kennedy became president. So in January 61, Stone wrote an article which he titled, quote, "Never were so many warnings ignored as in Laos," end quote. The journalist Stone wrote, quote, "The Laotian crisis illustrates how ineffectively democratic controls operate in overseeing the vast American empire and in checking on the activities of the obscure satraps who determine its destinies," end quote. Stone wrote that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator Fulbright, had unanimously endorsed Ambassador J. Graham Parsons for a promotion to Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. Stone was furious at Fulbright because apparently his committee was unaware or ignored a 1958 General Accounting Office report on waste and corruption in the U.S. aid program in Laos, overseen by Ambassador Parsons. Stone surmised that Fulbright had also ignored another report. This is a quote from Stone. "The Porter-Hardy Subcommittee of the House of Representatives Government Operations took 984 pages of testimony on the Laotian situation in the spring of 1959 and published a scathing report on the role played by our Ambassador J. Graham Parsons in presiding complacently from 1955 to 1957 over what was probably the most corrupt of all U.S. aid operations, and in railroading out of the country for so-called nervous disorder, a Government Accountability Office auditor who claimed close to discovering the truth about the net of bribery and perjury which shielded the waste of millions there." Stone wrote that the U.S. used its influence to block 1954 elections in Vietnam, called for in the 1954 Geneva Accords, but also tried to do the same thing in Laos. He wrote the United States spent $300 million to prevent reunification of Laos, quote, by free elections under the supervision of a tripartite international commission of Canada, India, and Poland, and the establishment of a coalition government with the Pathet Lao, end quote. Over U.S. objections, the elections were held in 1958, but after the International Commission departed Laos, quote, there was a rightist coup, the leaders of the Pathet Lao were thrown in jail, an army dictatorship was brought into power, and the civil war resumed, end quote. Another coup in 1960 resulted in Mr. Parsons being sent back to Laos with a threat from the U.S. State Department of a, quote, loss of American aid to the Laotian government if it did not end attempts to negotiate with the communist Pathet Lao movement, end quote. Stone also wrote that U.S. policies strengthened the Laotian leftists. In support of a large Laotian army, the U.S. flooded Laos with so much money that the cost of living doubled between 1953 and 1958, enriching a few merchants and government officials, but as the 1959 Porter-Hardy reports stated, quote, tended to lend credence to the communist allegation that the Royal Lao government was corrupt and indifferent to the needs of the people, end quote. Stone wrote that despite Laos having the highest paid army in Asia, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, much of the military aid was diverted to a few leaders and the Army was unable to, quote, stand up against handfuls of guerrillas and even a few determined battalions, end quote. Sounds a lot like Iraq in the last 10 years. Stone concluded this 1961 article saying, quote, the path to peace lies in reconvening the International Supervisory Commission and in return to the principles of the 1954 Geneva Accords, end quote. Writing 5 years later, in May of 1966, Stone wrote, and I think he was and is still correct, that, quote, behind the scenes, one feels that in Vietnam, as in Laos and elsewhere, the military and the CIA pursue their own policies, whatever the conflicting directives and contradictory rhetoric from Washington, end quote. In the December 1964 column, Stone wrote the U.S. policy in Laos, quote, was split in three ways because the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. military, and the CIA have each had independent sources of funds and independent channels of communication to Washington, end quote. Stone wrote this article, in this end of 1964 article, that, quote, it is the idea of building a series of advanced bases around communist China which explains the course of events from 1954 onward, end quote. In his 1967 book, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, the late historian Howard Zinn agreed with I.F. Stone on many facets of the US war in Laos. He said that the 1954 Geneva Accords were designed to, quote, provide for Laos to be a neutral state between pro-Western Thailand and communist North Vietnam, and for the left-wing Pathet Lao to be integrated into the country's political life, end quote. Zinn said the American aid program, begun soon after the Geneva Accords, was designed to wipe out the Pathet Lao and maintain Laotian right-wing governments in power against neutralist opponents. American aid enriched the Laotian elite, resulting in neutralists siding with the left and enhancing the power of the Pathet Lao and the percent of the land in Laos that they dominated. One of Zinn's conclusions was that American support for an anti-democratic and anti-communist government, quote, cost America the support of large numbers of non-communists and ultimately strengthened the communists, end quote, in Laos. So Stone and Zinn are in agreement that the U.S. war was counterproductive to its intended but secret goals. Most of the literature I read asserted that the U.S. war in Laos was designed to slow the flow of soldiers and supplies from North Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a series or a massive maze of interconnected paths that ran hundreds of miles through Laos and Vietnam. Dan Hampton, author of The Hunter Killers, which is a new book about the U.S. air war in Vietnam, wrote that about 30 tons of supplies per day moved along the trail that was created in the late 1950s. However, the United States had bombed all 18 of Laos's provinces, even parts of Laos hundreds of miles from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. About 1.7 million tons were dropped on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and nearby, and about 321,000 tons, about twice the bombardment of Japan in World War II, on the Plain of Jars in northeast Laos, home of 200,000 people and the remains of the ancient civilization that the Plain of Jars is named for. The U.S. dropped an average of 129,000 tons a year from 1965 to 1968, and an average of 387,000 tons a year from 1969 to 1972, according to Alfred W. McCoy, author of a book titled Torture and Impunity, the U.S. Doctrine of Coercive Interrogation. Cluster bombs. Cluster bombs are designed as anti-personnel and anti-armor weapons. They were invented by the Soviet Union in 1943. More than 95% of the cluster bomb victims worldwide since then have been civilians, and more than 1,000 are children. It is amazing to me that humans could even design cluster bombs, let alone use them. Airplanes or cruise missiles or artillery can fire a large pod or box that soon opens in the air. I think most of them are dropped from airplanes. I have a photo of it here. I'll pass around. You can see the pod opening. not a great photo, but. Hundreds of small individual bomblets, each about the size of a baseball, fly out in all directions. An area the size of 1 or 2 or 3 football fields is drenched by the bomblets, each of which, if it explodes, sends dozens or hundreds of pieces of razor-sharp shrapnel that slice through the bodies of nearby humans and animals. Mr. McCoy wrote that the U.S. used 2 types of cluster bombs in Laos. The earlier version was called the Rockeye-2, or also called the Cluster Bomb Mark 20, a 7-foot clamshell that opened in mid-flight, releasing 247 sharp-edged bomblets, each of which could detonate on impact, discharging 200 steel pellets. Thus, one canister could release almost 50,000 pellets over a football field-sized area. This was replaced in 1970 with the CBU-38 that had a reusable canister containing 40 14-pound anti-personnel bomblets with bigger fragments, greater fragment velocity, and more incendiary effects than the older cluster bomb type. In Southeast Asia, perhaps 1/3 did not explode, but lay on the ground where they can explode years later, killing and injuring. Some are still on the ground, but many others have over the years sunk into the topsoil a few inches, hidden from view, but still capable of detonating if walked over or touched by a shovel, a hoe, a person, or an animal. In a March 16, 2015 article in The Nation magazine titled "The Lethal Legacy of the US War in Vietnam," Chuck Searcy, a former American soldier in Vietnam who now lives in Hanoi, said, quote, "If you find 1 or 2 bombs, you can assume that there are others in the area," end quote, due to the unique cluster bomb strike pattern. A 2013 information sheet on cluster bomb facts produced by the Legacies of War Project reported that between 1973 and 2009, 20,000 Laotians were killed by previously unexploded ordnance. 60% of these casualties resulted in deaths, and almost 60% of the victims were children. What was it like for people on the ground under cluster bomb attacks? A good place to get this information is from Voices from the Plain of Jars, Life Under an Air War, a 1972 book by Fred Branfman, an American anti-war activist who helped expose the US war in Laos with this book. I have a copy of it over here. Mr. Branfman, who died last year, collected drawings, poems, and memoirs from about 2000, in 1970, from about 2,000 Laotian peasants who had experienced firsthand the US air war. A Plain of Jars refugee was quoted in Branfman's book saying, quote, "There wasn't a night when we thought we'd live until morning. Never a morning we thought we'd survive until night. Did our children cry? Well, yes, and we did too. I just stayed in my cave. I didn't see the sunlight for 2 years. What did I think about? Oh, I used to repeat, please don't let the planes come, please don't let the planes come, please don't let the planes come." Branfman's book was reprinted 2 years ago. Branfman was born in New York, moved to Laos as an education advisor in 1967, and became fluent in Laotian. He visited refugee camps and interviewed 2,000 people, quote, "and everyone told the same story," end quote. He had received a draft deferment to teach and advise educators in Laos. He was expelled from Laos in 1971 under pressure from the United States Embassy, according to an article by Christopher Hitchens. Writing in 1971 in the New York Times, Branfman said, quote, "Each without exception said that his village had been totally leveled by bombing. Each without exception said that he had spent months or even years on end hiding in holes or trenches dug into the foothills," end quote. Laotians told him their thatch and timber houses burned like candles, only the red bare earth remained. Paddies and ponds were poisoned, killing the ducks. Children picked up the bomblets and their arms blew off. Everyone dug holes to hide in during the day, emerging at night to try to plant rice unseen, but bombs fell into the holes too. Determined to get the story out while still in Laos, he had Laotians draw and write. When the book was published in 1967, President Nixon admitted to the war in Laos, but insisted that the U.S. was not targeting civilians. Bramfman said that while he was in Laos, after discovering the evidence of the massive bombing, it was, quote, as if I had discovered Auschwitz when it was still going on, end quote. Bramfman testified before Congress. He was furious at Senator Edward Kennedy for refusing to subpoena the U.S. ambassador to Laos, William Sullivan, after Sullivan had lied to his subcommittee, Kennedy's subcommittee, about the bombing. Sullivan under oath testified that no civilians were targeted. Kennedy knew otherwise, having previously issued a report stating so. Bramfman concluded from this experience and others that the U.S. government officials cared more about their careers than about Laotians, and that the executive branch had taken over the U.S. government and waged illegal wars. Bramfman saw the U.S. war in Laos as a new kind of warfare, a technical war in which machines rather than men did most of the killing, and with commanders who were completely unconcerned about the human consequences. He saw, quote, American atrocities in Laos not so much as inhuman as ahuman. The people of Nanaga and Nong Sa were not the object of anyone's passion. They simply weren't considered. What is most striking about American bombing in Laos is the lack of animosity felt by the killers to their victims, end quote. I'm not sure if I agree with him on that lack of animosity, but that's his opinion. A 26-year-old nurse from the Plain of Jars told Bramfman that before the bombing, quote, around that village of mine were green and beautiful mountains, and the land and fields my neighbors had sweated over and labored on since the time of my ancestors. My neighbors were all farmers, honest and hardworking. Our happiness was full and overflowing. Just a second. Our happiness was full and overflowing because we were content with our lives, even though we lived in the wilderness, end quote. A 13-year-old boy had similar thoughts. He said, quote, at the time my life was filled with great happiness, for the mountains and forests were beautiful, land, water, and climate were suitable for us, and there were so many homes in our little village, end quote. A 30-year-old Laotian woman said that during the bombing, quote, our lives became like those of animals, desperately trying to escape the hunters. Our lives were confided to the Lord Buddha. No matter when, all we did was pray to the Lord to save our lives. We didn't know how long we would stay alive. But looking at the faces of my children who were losing the so very precious happiness of childhood, as each and every day we would seek escape somewhere in the forest, I would grow increasingly miserable because of the war and hate it more and more, end quote. A nurse wrote, this is a quote, we who were young took our sweat and strength, which should have been spent raising food in the rice fields and forests to sustain our lives, and instead squandered it digging holes to protect ourselves. For many days and nights, having enough food to survive on became a gigantic problem which pressed upon our hearts. The fields, paddy, and seed beds all became bomb craters. All that remained for our people were sad faces and tired and weak hearts, disgusted with hating the war, which was like a large stone weighing upon us. We could not understand or imagine why something like this could happen, end quote. The 39-year-old farmer wrote, they dropped 8 napalm bombs, the fire from which burned all my things, 16 buildings along with all of our possessions inside, as well as maiming our animals. Some people who didn't reach the forest in time were struck and fell, dying most pitifully. By the time the fire died down, it was dark. Everyone came out of hiding to look at the ashes of their houses. Even the rice was burnt, end quote. Efforts to clean up the cluster bombs. Very little organized cleanup efforts were attempted prior to 1994. The USSR helped clean one large state farm. Laotian villagers and individuals also undertook cluster bomb removal activities, often with deadly results, and more than 10,000 killed or injured. In 1994, the Mennonite Central Committee based in the United States, the Mines Advisory Group, and the Laotian government launched an unexploded ordnance clearance project. The project soon drew support from the United Nations and other nations, which generated some funding. Titus Preachy of the Mennonite Central Committee, who lived many years in Laos, reported in 2001 that from 1996 to 1998, more than 122,000 pieces of unexploded ordnance were cleared, and 1/2 to 3/4 of this was cluster bombs. He said that by 2000, 8 international partners, the Laotian government and local Laotians, were removing unexploded ordnance from half of Laos's 18 provinces and educating local people about the dangers. Local villagers often brought unexploded bomblets to the work sites, leaving them there. Carrying these bomblets was and is very dangerous, but some Laotians take the risks of doing it. Mr. Preacher said the unexploded ordnance is, quote, everywhere, and clearance teams can only begin to create tiny islands of safety in a giant sea of ordnance, end quote. He said roving teams of ordnance removers destroy bomblets lying on the surface of the ground to prevent curious children from touching them, but this does not make the land safe for agricultural use because, quote, bomblets that bury themselves on impact often work their way to the surface as time passes. Through the natural expansion and contraction of the soil and erosion, new bomblets appear where none could be seen before. Little reductions in the rate of injury and death had resulted by 2001, he said, with about 1 casualty occurring every 2 days on average in Laos. A 2011 article, this is 10 years later, about Titus Preachy and his wife Linda Gaiman, his partner in this activity, reported that by 2010 the Unexploded Ordnance Project, now administered by the Laotian government, employed more than 1,000 people. The article written by Linda Espenshad of the Mennonite Central Committee reported that about 1/2 of 1 million of the 80 million bomblets had been cleaned, and that injuries and deaths had remained steady at about 300 annually. An April 5, 2015, New York Times article reported that in 2014, 56,400 munitions were found and destroyed in Laos. The article said U.S. spending to remove unexploded bombs from Laos had increased from about $2.5 million in 2005 to $15 million this year. Bombs are most often accidentally detonated in Laos by, quote, children who play with them, scavengers seeking scrap metal to sell, and villagers who unintentionally build cooking fires near where they are buried, end quote, according to this Times article. A total of $40 million is being spent in Laos this year to remove unexploded bombs, with money coming from the United States, Australia, Ireland, Japan, Norway, and Sweden. The United States provided $9 million a year in 2012 and 13, and $12 million in 2014, $15 million this year. So the U.S. funding trend is at least on an upward slope. The number of people killed and injured in Laos by old bombs decreased from about 300 annually 5 years ago to less than 50 in the last 2 years, and that's due to a massive, intense, and very effective education campaign undertaken by the Laotian government and by the people who are doing the clearance of the bombs. So that's some good news. Cluster bomb ban treaty. In late May 2008, 111 nations meeting in Dublin, Ireland, signed an international treaty to ban the manufacture, stockpiling, and use of cluster munitions. The Bush administration vigorously opposed the treaty, and the U.S. has yet to sign or abide by it. The U.S., Israel, and other nations boycotted the treaty negotiations. The United Kingdom, sometimes called Great Britain, signed on to the treaty, breaking with the United States, a huge setback for the United States. Human Rights Watch said in 2008 the U.S. is the world's largest producer, stockpiler, and user of cluster munitions, and used them in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in the former Yugoslavia. In a June 1, 2008 editorial, the New York Times said that U.S., Russia, and China had more than 1 billion cluster munitions stockpiled. The first review conference of state parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions was held in Dubrovnik, Croatia in September. A pre-conference report stated 116 nations had committed to the goals of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and 92 were full state parties. 22 state parties had destroyed 80% or more of their stockpiles. Cluster munitions have been used in recent years in Cambodia, Libya, Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen, according to the report written by the conference planners. Mother Jones magazine reported in June that fighter jets from Saudi Arabia-led coalition are using cluster bombs, some supplied by the United States in Yemen. The report said in 2013, Textron Systems Corporation was awarded a $641 million contract to produce 1,500 cluster bombs for Saudi Arabia. These weapons are banned under the Convention of Cluster Munitions, but apparently not in the United States. U.S. law allows the sale or supply of cluster bomb munitions if they have a failure to explode rate of less than or equal to 1%. That means if 99% or more of them detonate when they hit the ground. And if they are to be used only on specific military targets where civilians are not present. The failure rate in Yemen this year is above 1%. It's kind of an odd use of the word failure. On April 29th, a 10-year-old Yemeni boy picked up a bomblet that he said looked like a toy. It detonated, injuring him and the 3 adults he was with at the time. Amnesty International reported 2 months ago that its investigation of 13 airstrikes in Saudi Yemen found 2 types of American-made cluster bombs. The New York Times reported on September 3rd that the United States was in compliance with all of the provisions of the Cluster Bomb Treaty, despite not having signed on to it. This was not correct. They were correct that the United States hadn't signed on to it, but the United States is in violation of all of the provisions of Article 1 of the treaty, which says, quote, each state party undertakes never under any circumstances to A, use cluster munitions, B, develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer to anyone directly or indirectly cluster munitions, and C, assist, encourage, or induce anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this convention, end quote. Journalist Glenn Greenwald called the Times report a lie. He said in December 2009, right after Obama had won the Nobel Peace Prize, he authorized a cruise missile strike in Yemen that contained cluster bombs and killed 35 women and children. And Greenwald also reported that after this bombing occurred, a reporter in Yemen named Abdullah Haider Shea reported on this attack. And Obama was so furious that he ordered the Yemeni government to arrest this journalist, which they did, and he's been in prison for about 4 or 5 years, and I think he's still in prison today. So that's about all I got. I didn't really know how to end this thing. But thank you for listening. And if anybody has any questions or comments, or if I made any mistakes, I don't mind being corrected. But thank you.
It makes me think of Princess Diana, and before she died, she was working on, exposing the landmines. And there was a real push to clean things up, in Europe and elsewhere. And I remember her addressing the Laos and the cluster bombs there, and that if people took notice, and I think people thought like something was being done about it, so it would be all good now.
Sure. And
And then, it was addressed and actions were taken, and then what? I mean, when you said 50 a day, that's of course an improvement to,
No, 50 a year.
50, that's what I meant to say. 50 a year is an improvement to
Over
300 a year. But it's still 50 people.
Right.
It's just still a huge number.
Right.
I mean, if Americans were dying from landmines and cluster bombs unexploded at 50 a year, it would be on the news every day. And it's just because they're there and they're impoverished that people don't give a shit, basically, That's terrible.
But thank you. A couple of things. One is a landmine is different than a cluster bomb. A cluster bomb that
Right.
doesn't detonate when it hits the ground essentially becomes a landmine. And there is a landmine treaty from 1999 that the United States has not signed on to. Just about every other country has. I think there's about 10 who haven't. But last year, Obama announced that the United States would not use landmines anywhere except in Korea. That was the only exception where the United States would use landmines. And as far as Princess Diana is concerned, she was doing a campaign on this issue, but at the time that she died, her boyfriend was the son or the nephew of one of the wealthiest families in Egypt, and they had made their money as armaments dealers. I don't know whether she knew that or not, but I think that her reputation would have been destroyed if she had lived another month or two. But I don't take that away from the good work that she did do.
Yeah, I remember during the Vietnam War, when Vietnam veterans were coming back and they were organizing themselves into Vietnam Veterans Against the War, a number of them would talk about the secret war in Laos, because it wasn't just an air war. We actually had boots on the ground in Laos. We were doing some fighting. I don't know if it was to try to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail or what. And people would come back and say this, and I think this is part of the reason that we had to eventually acknowledge that we were conducting a secret war in Laos. A little bit it reminds me of what's going on in Yemen, because the horror that's going on in Yemen is it's just incredible. I mean, schools and hospitals are being hit on a daily basis. Thousands have died, thousands are home, 1.5 million are homeless. And the U.S., we call it a Saudi-led coalition, but it should be understood the U.S. is part of that coalition, that no bomb gets dropped by Saudi Arabia without, first of all, it's a U.S. bomb from a U.S. plane,
Right.
But it's logistical support, and the targets are determined by the United States, and U.S. Navy is off the coast stopping any aid from getting in there, and they have very serious water and food, and I know this isn't on Yemen, but in some sense, we're still conducting secret wars, and the media doesn't talk about Yemen, and it's a real vicious war that's going on right now.
It sure is. More than 2,000 people have been killed this year. And the American satellites in the sky are providing the information that the Saudis need to do their attacks, the precise coordinates of where things are that they want to hit.
Is the U.S. funding any effort in Laos now to remove cluster bomb
Yeah.
remains?
It's $15 million this year, which is up from $2.5 million 10 years ago. And a total of $40 million is being spent by the whole world in Laos. And there's at least 1,000 people doing the work. And I don't know how many people are doing the educating, teaching people how to avoid stepping on them or touching them. But still, of the 80 million bomblets, less than 1 million have been cleaned up. And it's 40 years after the war now. And they're scattered over, quite a... This is an article in the National Geographic. This is a map of Laos. And the red areas are where there's immense amounts of cluster bombs. So this is the plain of jars here, and this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail here. So this is an area maybe the size of 30 counties in New York State. Got 2 million tons of bombs.
You have a sense of a lot of this is farmland, or
Yes,
is much of it?
the plain of jars is mostly farmland. I think the Ho Chi Minh Trail area is more of a jungle,
Yeah, it's the image.
more of like highlands and forests. And the trail was like, if the Americans were to bomb a trail and knock out a section of it, they could, like within a day, carve out like a new trail or find a new path around that bombed out area in the woods. So it was an incredible dense maze of paths that were always shifting depending on the bombing.
Did the U.S. ever state what the purpose was? I mean, did they ever have an official, or was it the whole communist thing, just like in Vietnam, or was it a slightly different line with Laos, or what was the difference? I mean, I just remember at the time hearing that we gotta kill those communists, you know, like we hear now, we gotta kill those terrorists. It's like, we gotta have a target, you know?
Well, when the United States bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was to disrupt the flow of supplies from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The United States clearly said that. But when it was bombing the Plain of Jars in the north, I don't think the United States said why it was doing that. But the reason was because the Pathet Lao was very strong in that region. And there were North Vietnamese soldiers who were in that region as well, or near it. But I think that in the 1950s and 60s, the United States had this incredible fear of communism.
Yeah.
You know, the United States won World War II decisively, then 5 years later the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb. The Chinese communists drove the nationalists off the mainland, and then the Korean War started, all within the space of a year. And it must have seemed to a lot of Americans in 1950 that the world was going to hell, and that, you know, they'd be in Los Angeles in another 5 years if we didn't fight everybody. And
Domino theory.
pardon?
It was part of the domino theory.
Yeah, it was the domino theory that if one country went to communism, then they all would. And
Strikingly similar, the way the whole McCarthy hearings and such developed, fearing a lot of our own citizens. Okay? It's strikingly similar to what we're afraid of right now, viewing our Muslim population too often as totally embedded with terrorists or people that are suspect.
yeah, there are quite a few similarities to today. But we have politicians like Nixon, who when he was running for vice president in 1952, he said, Harry Truman's been president for 7 years, and 700 million people have fallen to the communists. What's going to happen if we elect a Democrat? You know, it was this type of campaigning. And I think a lot of politicians were afraid that if they didn't come down really tough on the communists, that they would be accused of being soft on them and being weak, and then they might lose an election. And I think that's part of what contributed to President Johnson escalating the war so rapidly after he got elected in 1964. He was afraid that he would be attacked by Nixon and Goldwater and Reagan if he didn't. So there's really like a hysteria in the United States in the 50s and 60s.
Right, it was happening now.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And one of the first victims of that kind of an era is that truth doesn't matter, that people can lie. And then we see our politicians now blatantly lying and fooling a significant part of the population. It's really astounding.
It sure is. How uninformed people are despite having such easy access to information if they go look for it. They're listening to Fox News and hate radio, and it's just, they're nuts. I mean, I read some of the letters in the newspapers, and these people are out of their minds, but they're terrified. You know, they think that ISIS is around the corner.
You know, Trudy had mentioned something, one of the last events that I went to with you guys, and this dumbing down of our society and keeping people unawares and cutting funding to schools and cutting out social studies. And a lot of the schools now in the lower grades, when I was substitute teaching all over the capital region, it's a problem everywhere. It's not like the poor neighborhood or just this neighborhood or that. They were having science and social studies as a subject and teaching them approximately 3 times a week as, you know, but they have computers and language and all these other things, that just got pushed out of the picture. And I see it like purposeful. You have people that don't engage because they don't know. And here's just one example. There's a bus driver that drives the Rensselaer bus to Albany. Now he passes the Capitol 22 times a day at least, right? I said, do you go to the Capitol on Sunday? And he says to me, Capitol, Capitol, he keeps saying Capitol, what's the Capitol? This is all Albany. And I said, no, they're like the Capitol building. And yeah, I'm like, you're not from around here? No, he grew up in Albany. He doesn't know the Capitol building. He grew up in Albany on Hudson Avenue, looks at it his whole life, and drives past it 22 times a day on his route. But that's just a small example of how dumbed down they are. They don't know American history. They don't know current events. And it's purposeful to have a corporate media keep this information in an educational system that holds people back. They don't know any better.
Or they don't want to know better. That's part of it too. It's like, attitude like I don't care. I know what I want to know and that's it.
But in our educational system, there's a tremendous emphasis now on the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math. We don't need to have every kid in those fields. Maybe 15% would be enough, and then the rest could do other things. But yet the emphasis is that every kid should be learning these things, which is crazy.
What happened after Sputnik? Yeah, that was a whole thing changed.
But because of that, we're having the de-emphasis on geography. I mean, geography isn't taught in very many schools anymore, or history, or sociology. I agree with you.
Or our Constitution, so they don't even understand why it's important to stand up for yourself here.
Yeah. I think one of the points that Bradford made about the automated technological war, and that it's like a push-button war, and it's war from a distance. I think it's more so now with the United States. I mean, the United States just bombs one country after another from 25 or 30,000 feet, and the pilots don't see what's happening on the ground, and I think the American people don't see it either. And that's what, I think Laos was like a template for that even.
Drones.
Yeah, now we have drones. Anything else, anyone? Sure.
Another quick question. Do you think they really did forgive us? Do you really think the people of Laos have forgiven us?
I don't know. I imagine some have. I think a lot of them never could figure out why they were being targeted, especially in the plain of Jars, far from the war, where they were just farmers, just living their lives, just not making trouble for anybody, totally out of the Vietnam conflict at all. The photos in that book from that magazine, the National Geographic, you can see the craters in the ground in the plain of Jars. Those were made by the exploding ordnance.
National Geographic has now been taken over by Rupert Murdoch, so you won't see pictures like that very much longer.
I mean, the article wasn't that good, as it usually is usually the case with the National Geographic. Frequently the photos are more revealing than the article. But I have some other photos here. I have the book by Gramfman, which was reprinted last year, Zinn's book. Here's a photo of one of the jars. I mean, these jars are as spectacular as some of the activities of like the Romans and the Aztecs and the Incas. I mean, this must have been quite a civilization in Laos 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. But, I never even heard about it until I started reading up on this. I had heard of the plain of Jars, but I didn't realize that jars actually referred to jars.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you all for coming.